Sure. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Victoria Esses. I'm the director of the Network for Economic and Social Trends, known as NEST, and I'd like to welcome you to today's distinguished lecture. Before we get started with today's presentation, Leah Huffman, will present the land acknowledgement.
We would like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chungtung nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
And now it is a great pleasure to present our distinguished speakers for today, Katy Greenland and Keon West. Katy Greenland is an applied social psychologist at the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. She works with theories and methods from social and critical psychology, applying them to everyday practices and experiences. Katy's research addresses stigma, inequality, and discrimination, and she uses a wide variety of methods to examine these issues, from experiments to discourse analysis. Katy and I actually have never met before, but we go way back, and we actually published a paper together with several other authors in 2001 on intergroup ambivalence in information processing. Welcome, Katy.
Thank you.
Keon West is a social psychologist at Goldsmith University of London, the other London. His research focuses on detecting and reducing bias between different groups of people and strategies to promote positive mental health and well-being among those belonging to minority groups. Keon is the past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, an organization very dear to my heart, which focuses on applying rigorous research methods to addressing important social issues, similar to the goals of NEST. Keon, I found out today, is also a 2022 fellow of SPICY. Welcome, Keon.
Thank you.
And today, Katy and Keon will be talking to us about definitional boundaries of discrimination. What counts as discrimination, why, and what are the consequences? Over to you.
There we go. So thank you, Vicky. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I want to say something funny about people eating their sandwiches, but it's we got to do what we got to do, right? In busy schedules that squeeze our time. Okay, so we're going to talk about definitional boundaries of discrimination, and the kind of structure of the talk is that we're going to start with the idea that most people agree that discrimination is wrong, but most people also discriminate quite a lot. So the middle part of the talk, we're going to talk about kind of why, or maybe how that is. And we're going to come to the conclusion that this is because definitions of discrimination are socially constructed, and in practice, they're also narrow and inconsistent. And what you're going to see is that Keon and I are going to switch speakers every so often. We're going to switch between qualitative and quantitative data as well. And I need to give you a content warning because there is qualitative data in here, that this qualitative data includes racial and homophobic language. And I've edited that out as much as possible while trying to retain the broad meaning. So if we start with this idea that most people agree that discrimination is wrong, I don't think that's an argument that I particularly need to make with you folks, but you'll see that I've got a little sort of text box down there that's also referring to of other relevant literatures. So, for example, in some of the work that I've done, we know that people worry about being prejudiced, they worry about appearing to be prejudiced, and so this is this is a sort of common thread that people don't want to be, they don't want to discriminate, they don't want to be racist, for example. They worry about appearing to be that person. And now I'm going to pass over to Keon.
Great, thank you. You can hear me? Can you hear me? Great, fantastic. Okay, so let's do a little imaginative exercise. Let's say that I were to take this room full of people, so about 30 of us in the room, and I were to ask you where you think you sit relative to other people. So do you think, compared to the average person in the room, that you're more prejudiced than they are or less prejudiced than they are? And I want you to imagine where you would sit. And if you were to line everyone up in the room and put the most prejudiced person on one end and the least prejudiced person on another, where would you sit? And this is an interesting question because this is exactly what I did for two studies, actually, that I published in 2019. I asked people to do this twice, once for racism and once for sexism. And if we move on to the next slide, you'll see exactly what we found when we did that. So the interesting thing is that if you look at the red line, that's everyone's self-perception. So this graph is actually done in terms of egalitarianism. So we ask people, how much do you treat everyone equally on this dimension? And 100 being the most egalitarian people and 0 being the least. And the first thing you see is that the red line, the self-perception, never dips below 50% at any point in time. So literally everybody thinks that they're above average. But of course, we know that's not how averages work, because that doesn't make any sense. So if you actually test people, so if you ask them questions like, how much do you like Black people? How much do you think women should be at work? Then of course, some people will be in the top half and some people will be in the bottom half. And you get this interesting pattern where the red line of self-perception stays high, but the blue line of reality goes from low to high. And that's true if you go to the other side, to the one about sexism as well. So we did it twice, once with gender egalitarianism, once with racial egalitarianism, and both times you find this very neat pattern. In the paper, I attributed this to a Dunning-Kruger pattern, but since then, someone's shown me a lot of really good statistics that says maybe not, but it doesn't matter. The effect remains regardless of whether it's Dunning-Kruger in origin. So we know that people don't like to think of themselves as discriminatory or prejudiced. That's not something they like. They think, I'm not a racist person, I'm not sexist, and that's a fairly reliable effect. But we also know that people discriminate all the time. And you can see that in studies like this other study that I published in 2020. And this is a CV study. I really don't have to explain CV studies, I assume, because I'm pretty sure every one of you's done at least one of them at some point, but I'll walk through it anyway very quickly, just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page. So CV studies are some of the easiest studies to do because you just need a copy of a CV and you make a few hundred copies of it, or depending on your budget, a few thousand, if you have a really good grant behind you. And the only thing you change on the CV is the name. So you can change the name to make this identical CV be a white man CV, a white woman CV, a Black man CV, or a Black woman CV. Other than that, they're exactly the same. And then you send them out depending on what you're trying to do. You see how many callbacks you get. You see how much people think the person who has the CV is competent or hireable or whatever. And you see if the demographics affect what people think. And in this case, we did it in academic departments. So these are the results for biology departments. We also did it for physics departments. We did it a couple of different ways, but they look very much the same. So I'm just going to show you these. So you can see there's a clear gap between the white people on the left and the Black people on the right. And there's another gap between the men in blue and the women in green. And that's even though everyone has exactly the same CV. So if you look at that really big gap between the white man to the far left and the Black woman to the far right, that's an enormous gap considering that they have exactly the same qualifications. So we know people discriminate all the time. And there's other studies like this. So I did another study involving not just things like CVs, but essentially the same thing as a CV study, but using newspapers. So I had a newspaper article about someone who was doing bad stuff, who was bombing things or had bombs in his shed or was a nefarious, suspicious character. And I created two versions of this. Actually, we did this study twice as well. So there was one version where there was a story about a white man who was doing bad things, and we created a second version by taking out his picture and putting in a brown picture and taking out his name and putting in a brown sounding name. So we changed Paul Smith to Muhammad something or other. And then we'd ask people, is this person a terrorist? Is this terrorism? And is it bad? So it's essentially just a CV study again, except you swap out white Christian for brown Muslim, and you swap out jobs for perceptions of crimes. And when you do that, you find very similar, very interesting results. So people are much more likely to say, yes, this looks like terrorism if it's a brown person doing it than a white person doing it. Interestingly, this isn't just because of the cultural connotations of terrorism. People are also more likely to say it is bad, which is weird because I think this is unambiguously bad stuff, but maybe people think that there's a reason to do it, or maybe they attribute it to mental health difficulties, maybe they assign it something else, but it's interpreted as immoral in a more clear, straightforward way if you're a Muslim than if you're a white non-Muslim person. Now, up till this point, we could say that people are perhaps discriminating unconsciously, because I know unconscious bias is still kind of a big popular topic of conversation, at least amongst lay people, not so much among psychologists. But we know that people also discriminate openly and explicitly as well. So this study is, I don't think, theoretically necessarily that interesting. It's a straightforward within participant study asking people how they would like, or how likely are they to have the following kinds of relationships with the following kinds of people. And they pick between casual sex and marriage, and they pick between white people, Black people, East Asian people, and South Asian people. And this is with a sample of about 3,000 British people. Now, the interesting thing isn't so much, I mean, it is interesting. There's a clear preference for white people. And also there's a preference for white people and marriage. You'd rather marry them than have casual sex with them. And the preference runs the other way for ethnic minorities. You'd rather have sex with them than marry them. But what's more interesting is that this is a within participants design. We did not hide what we were doing. We said, we are asking you how you respond to white people, Black people, East Asian people, and South Asian people. And the participants said, we fully understand this, we prefer white people. So there is a tendency to discriminate anyway, despite the overarching sense that people do not discriminate. And the question is, how do they square those two really strange things? And I'll hand back over to Katy.
Thanks, Keon. So people agree that discrimination is wrong, but they do it anyway. And they know that they're doing it anyway, or they know that they're treating people differently anyway. So why, or rather how, are people able to, as Keon says, sort of square that circle, if that's the expression, and make sense of this? And we would argue that that's because they say that what they're doing isn't really discrimination. So when if I fill in Keon's measure about who I'm willing, who I want to have sex with and who I want to marry, and I write down, well, what I'm not interested in dating people from this group, or I am interested in dating people from this group, then I'll have an argument for explaining why this isn't really discrimination. And that's what we're interested in this project. We're interested in the way that people are able to define some kinds of actions and events as discrimination, and other kinds of acts and events as not discrimination. And as an audience, I'm hoping I don't need to persuade you that this is interesting, but also that this is an increasing social issue, kind of arguments about what is and isn't racism, what counts as racism and what doesn't count. And equally, I don't think I need to persuade you that this is something consequential, that it matters how we define what is discrimination and what isn't discrimination. So what we're interested in this project are the sort of cultural tools that people are deploying in order to do that decision making. So we're starting from the position that discrimination, what we call discrimination, is socially constructed. So it's not something that is a sort of objective reality. It's something that is constructed in social interactions and therefore has the capacity to change as the context changes. And specifically, what we want to show you today is that the definitions, the way that people define discrimination, are often very narrow, and they're also often very inconsistent. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take you through some examples of qualitative and quantitative literature. And then there are 3 quantitative studies that are about definitions of discrimination very specifically towards the end. But let's start with the qualitative data. So this is, I'll just hold on for a minute before I click on to the next slide. This is a corpus of data of people talking about forms of discrimination. So this is people talking about racism. This is people talking about homophobia in particular. And these are white folks talking about racism, they're black and brown folks talking about racism, this is straight people, this is gay people, lots of different groups of people all talking about the same thing. So if you like, people who have vested interest and experience and people not so much. So this first extract that I'm going to show you is looking at how the way that we define discrimination in talk is often very narrow. This is Harvey, and Harvey is a white man, and he's talking about discrimination, and he's talking about, do we know Jeremy Clarkson? Can you nod at me if you know who Jeremy Clarkson is? Right, okay, so Jeremy Clarkson is, so he's not a sort of, you might describe him, how would you describe Jeremy Clarkson, Keon? He's a sort of right-wing.
He's a laddie man, a lad's man.
Yeah.
That probably doesn't say very much.
Yeah, he's maybe, if I say Tucker Carlson.
He says it like it is.
He says it like it is.
Does that help?
So yeah. he's a sort of, so this is a story about Jeremy Clarkson, who he's a television personality, and Jeremy Clarkson was recorded on television reciting a nursery rhyme that contained a pejorative word. It contained the N-word. So he was recorded on television using the N-word as part of the nursery rhyme. And what Harvey says is, he says, someone like Jeremy Clarkson, not a lot of people know who he is as a person. You don't know whether he says that, whether he says the N-word under his breath as a racist or as a non-racist, because you don't know him. So if so, like, racism is so dependent on the beliefs that a person has, because if you know what their beliefs are, then you know whether or not something that comes out, you'll know the meaning of what it is. You'll have a much better idea of the meaning of what is coming out of their mouth. And I bet we've heard this argument before, right? So this is, we call this an intention argument. And intentions are something that we know about from the academic literature, that the intentions seem to matter in the way that people talk about and think about discrimination. So the kind of the crux of the argument is that you have to understand what somebody really thinks. You have to understand what somebody really believes in order to kind of understand if they really meant to do this thing or not, if their intention was to do this thing or not. And if they intended to do it, then yes, you can say that it was probably racist. But if they didn't intend to do it, if it was an accident or a misstep, or if they were ignorant on it, then maybe it's not racism. And this emphasis on intention, as I say, it's very common in kind of public discourse. There are some examples of quantitative experimental research that have looked at this specifically. So we shouldn't be surprised when people make these kind of intention arguments. We should be able to see that intention arguments are kind of narrowing, that they narrow the definition of what counts as what and what doesn't count, because it means that the act itself doesn't have meaning. It's something about the intention behind the act that makes it discrimination or not discrimination. But it's narrowing in other kinds of ways as well. And I'm going to show you another example to kind of explain how this might work. So this is a group of young men who identified as straight, and they're talking about the word gay. They're talking about when it's okay and when it's not okay to use the word gay. This is in a focus group. So we've got Ross, and Ross says, well, they are what we would call each other, ain't it? As a laugh. Probably wouldn't call a gay person that unless they'd done something to piss you off, sorry for the language. And Ryan says, yeah, like when we was out and that boy, and they mutter a bit, and Ryan says, I know. Yeah, he said to me, I pushed in front of him, right? And I was queuing as much as he was. And you could tell he was gay, right? So I said to him, look, buddy, I was here first. And he was offering me on mine. They're Welsh, so that's a kind of, he was going on at me. But I knew he was gay and he kept shouting. So I told him to F off the, and then there's a really offensive homophobic slur that he said at that point. So this is a really specific story. Those of us who know discourse, then this is a sort of, this is a story with quite a lot of facticity in it. It's a very specific story about having an argument with somebody about where you are in a queue. So they're queuing to go into a club, and there's an argument about whose place it is in the queue. And in the course of this argument, Ryan says something which is, I mean, to put it in discourse, we would say this is hearably homophobic. It's really, really offensive, a really, really offensive combination of words. But Ryan is saying that it's okay in this context. And in fact, his friends all agree that yes, it was okay in this context, because Ryan is saying, he's using an intention argument. He's saying that his intention was to respond to a provocation. So yes, he was in an argument. Yes, he used really offensive homophobic language, but his intention was not to be homophobic. His intention was to cause offense, was to be aggressive, was to insult somebody, and the language was just, it was just the thing that was available because he happened to know that this person was gay. So what this means then, the way that people can deploy intention arguments is that they can use these arguments in practice to make the definition of discrimination just in vanishingly small terms, because there's always another reason why you do the thing that you do. There's always, because they cut me up at the traffic lights, because they looked at me funny, because they had their music on too loud, because they, you know, got the promotion and I didn't. There's always another reason that you can use to explain why you did what you did. So intention arguments, and this is just one kind of argument that people use, but intention arguments squeeze out so many of the kind of situations that we might consider to be discrimination. You can always say there's another reason why I did it. So the definitions of discrimination, we would argue, are often very narrow when they hinge around things like intentions. But these definitions are also often very inconsistent. So this is the second examples of data that I'm going to show you are about how the same series of events can be constructed as discrimination or not discrimination, depending on the rhetorical work that's involved. So this is Ollie, and Ollie identifies as a gay man, and he's talking about where he lived. He's an undergraduate student, and he's talking about the various places that he lived as an undergraduate, and he's talking to Richard, who's the researcher. And Ollie says, the second half, he's talking about the second half of the year. The second half, it was difficult last year. Yes, it was fine because I lived with 2 girls, 2 boys and me. And then this year, I lived with 4 boys. 3 were Polish, 1 was English, and it was awful until Christmas. And then I moved upstairs to where the other student warden lives because it's all girls. Student wardens is, I'm sure you have that as well, right? You get cheaper rent if you live as a student warden in accommodation, because they were just really noisy, really quite hostile as well. Because I'm quite camp, I suppose, and I just don't hide it anyway to anyone. And I think they're a bit threatened by it. And they just kept, oh, it was just childish banter, I think. So this is Ollie talking about how he experienced homophobic abuse and homophobic bullying to the extent that he had to move out of where he was living and move into somewhere else. So that's pretty unambiguous as a form of discrimination in the way that he was treated. But later on in the same interview, in the same interaction, when Richard asks him, so Richard is the researcher, when Richard says to him, have you had any negative experiences here at, and he names the university, Ollie says no. And he redefines discrimination. He says, Richard says, because of your sexual orientation, and Ollie says, no, apart from the Polish boys. So he accepts that something happened with the Polish boys, but he says, living in residence, I don't blame them for that because that's what they've been brought up with. And then he says, and then he talks about how he's quite confident, right? So it's this in one part of the data, in one extract of the data, he says that he has experienced homophobic bullying and discrimination, and in the same interview later on, he says that he hasn't. So the same experience can be reconstructed as discrimination or not discrimination as the context changes. And we would argue that this is rhetorical. In fact, it's because there was different identity work happening in different parts of the data set. And we can even see this, and I bet this is also going to be really familiar to you, in the way that people sometimes justify action that we might see as kind of right-wing and anti-immigrant kind of positions. So this is some data. This is a focus group of people talking about the Brexit referendum. So the in the Brexit referendum, people who voted for Brexit, so this is British people voting to leave the European Union, that voting for Brexit was widely constructed as indicative of racism, that voting for Brexit was something that people kind of agreed that was a kind of racist thing to do, that people would do that. So Emily, the interviewer, she's asking them about Brexit, and she says, this is before the Brexit vote, she's talking to them. So she says, so if you wanted to leave, would that not give you a bad self-image? Would you not get judged for wanting to leave? And Erin says, well, you don't have to justify your vote to anyone. No one sees you vote. And then Peter says, leaving the EU kind of helps people that are refugees or like non-EU citizens, more in terms of migration, I suppose, because it means that people from Europe aren't in front of the queue. It will be equal for everyone now, and that's why it's less racist. So in Peter's account, this thing that is widely understood to be kind of racist, voting for Brexit, he argues the exact contrary, because he says that the entire EU project was racist because most people in Europe apparently are white. And therefore, by leaving the EU, that would enable more people from India or China or the Middle East or Africa. It would make it more possible for people to enter the country, and that was why it was less racist. So Peter's able to rework the definition of what is and isn't racist in order to justify a sort of anti-immigrant position. And I'm going to hand back to Keon now.
Great. So we've seen that definitions of discrimination can be both narrow and inconsistent. So I'm going to point to 3 specific ways in which they can be inconsistent, just so we get an idea of what it is we're looking at. Admittedly, 2 things. One, other people have done these things as well, so I'm not going to claim to be the first or even the one who's done it the best. So, we'll point to other papers who've done it just as well or better. But also, I understand that some of these aren't necessarily definitions of discrimination, but motivations, but it's still indicative of what people think. So one way in which discrimination is inconsistently defined is across types of discrimination. So if, for example, in a study as I did, you ask people how motivated are you to not be racist versus how motivated are you to not be prejudiced against people with schizophrenia, you'll notice a marked difference. That generally people think a blackface costume is hideously offensive, at least most people I know do, but they don't think that a schizophrenia or mental health patient costume is as hideously offensive. You can still buy those in stores today. So that's one way. A second way in which discrimination is inconsistently defined is between different groups of people or between cultures. So again, same paper, you can ask different people the same question. How motivated are you to not be prejudiced against gay people? And you'll find that in countries like the US and the UK, people generally say, I'm very strongly motivated. In countries like Jamaica, not so much. So that's a difference. It's the same group, but in different places, people feel differently about it. And it's also worth noting the arguments that they use when they explain it. They say things like, our people know the difference, Black is a race, Jew is a religion, and slur is a sin. And by that, they excuse some kinds of discrimination. They're not discriminatory people, they're just treating it differently for different reasons. And a third way is that it's inconsistently defined within individuals. And I think this is a really good example for us as psychologists, because I'm assuming you're aware of microaggressions and how they've blown up as being this incredibly important area of social psychology. And then a few years ago, a couple of people really started a microaggressions pushback, essentially saying that microaggressions are nonsense and they're pathological and it's this ridiculous hand-wringing and it's gone too far. that they're not even really looking at real discrimination anymore or real prejudice. We're looking at something else, something that should be below the threshold and that shouldn't count. I actually contributed to this argument in my own way by looking at these claims of what they call hypersensitivity. This idea that ethnic minorities are not responding to real discrimination, they're responding to some silly small stuff that no one would pay any attention to, and these people just need to stop being so sensitive. I did that in 3 studies. So in the first study, I got white people and ethnic minorities in the UK, and I simply asked them how frequently they experienced lists of things that were on the microaggressions list and how happy they were overall. So a generic measure of life satisfaction. And if the hypersensitivity thing was true, then we should find that the relationship between microaggressions and bad life satisfaction should be much stronger for ethnic minorities than for white people, since they're being all hypersensitive. But we didn't find anything like that. We found that in general, everybody didn't really like being treated rudely by waiters or, having a hard time getting into hotels. But there wasn't an interaction between, I know it might look like a little interaction, but A, it's not actually significant. And then B, if it is, it's in the wrong direction, and that the majority people seem to be the ones who are slightly more sensitive. So that doesn't seem to be happening. I did a second study that was essentially exactly the same study, trying to get rid of the cultural explanations perhaps. And to do that one, I somewhat cleverly just got Koreans. Everyone was Korean, except the majority Koreans lived in Korea and the minority Koreans lived in the UK. And unsurprisingly, minority Koreans experienced more microaggressions than majority Koreans, but there wasn't an interaction for how severely they responded to the microaggression. So the hypersensitivity doesn't appear to be there. And in another study, I had people recall a microaggressive event. This is primarily because I didn't have the budget to set up a real restaurant and then do microaggressions to people. But if you make people recall events, you get very much the same effect as if they did it. So I was willing to work with that. But we get people to recall a microaggressive event and see if that lowers their positive affect. So we test their positive affect before and after. And in that study, again, we had white and ethnic minority British people. You find that in general, ethnic minority British people are less happy about restaurants, but you don't find an interaction effect. Microaggressions or recalling microaggressions produces reduced affect for everyone, but it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. So there's not really evidence for this microaggressions argument, but it is an argument that is made in psychology even now. And that's a sign of inconsistency within us, that some of us think things should count as discrimination and others of us do not. That's an individual difference. Right, I'll hand back to Katy actually no, I'll do a quick summary and then I'll hand back to Katy. So sorry about that. So far we've got to here, right? So we know that discrimination is socially constructed. People have to make up the definitions, but the definitions are often really narrow in that it's almost impossible to actually call any specific thing discrimination. And it's really inconsistent. It varies between places, between types, and between individuals. And so what we're trying to work on here is a specific way of measuring that. How do we measure what people define as discrimination and see where it changes and what happens to it? And that's what we're trying to do next. And now I'll hand over to Katy.
No, thanks, Keon. And there's a whole bunch of theory behind this, right? So you can ask us all this sort of theoretical stuff, but we're going to go straight to, we're going to go pretty much straight to the data. So what we did was we developed a measure that picks up on a lot of these kinds of arguments. So there were a number of themes you can see on the left-hand side of themes that seem to be present in a lot of the arguments that we hear. And then we developed example items to pick up on those kinds of themes in particular. So it's a 15-item measure with 1 to 7 Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And they're triangulated from qualitative and quantitative research. And I didn't have space here to put all the other things that are related to this or all the other things that we could cite. They ask us about that, because there's a whole bunch of kind of qualitative and quantitative literature behind this to support these particular kinds of themes. So we've got this idea of the importance of intention. I talked about that one already. There's also the idea that discrimination is performed by a particular kind of person. So there's a group of people who are racists, and then there's everybody else who's normal. I'm not saying I believe these things, right? I'm saying these are arguments which are circulating in culture. People will often say that you need a really strong evidence base before you start pointing the finger at somebody. That claims of discrimination are also illegitimate. This is the sort of oversensitive thing that Keon was talking about before. And that the problem of discrimination is small and or mostly limited to the past. So we designed this measure, as I say, it's 15 items, and we designed it so that you can swap out one form of discrimination for another. So you can swap out racism for sexism, for example, and you're going to see an example of that in a moment. So the first question is, does this measure predict people's attributions to discrimination? Do people who agree with these kinds of arguments, are they more or less likely to make an attribution to discrimination? So we did this study with Colette van Laar in Leuven. These are undergraduate students. We pre-tested them on our 15-item measure. And then in a between subjects design, we gave them a vignette to read that was interpretable either as an act of discrimination, an employer who doesn't promote one of his employees, or as an act of embezzlement in failing to monitor the way that an expense account was being used. So, so you have a scenario in which people are, in which there's an ambiguous text from which people could make an attribution to discrimination, or a comparable control text with a comparable moral violation. And our prediction is that people who score high on the DBD score, that should also be more likely to make attributions to discrimination, but there shouldn't be a relation between DBDs and their attributions to embezzlement. And that's what we find. So what you can see on this graphic, so the graph on the left-hand side is the extent to which they made those attributions. And what you can see, it depends which way we code it. And I think actually Keon and I have coded it in opposite directions across our slides. But what you can see is that the red line is participants in the discrimination condition. That relationship is significant, whereas the blue line, participants in the embezzlement condition, that relationship is not significant. So there's a relationship between DBDs and attributions in the discrimination condition. There's no relationship, or not a significant relationship, between attributions and between DBDs and attributions in the embezzlement condition. We also asked participants how much they blamed the alleged perpetrator, so the manager who either didn't promote somebody and or embezzled money. And we see the same thing. There's a relationship in the discrimination condition such that people who agreed with those kinds of items in the 15-item measure were more likely, or depends which way you code it, but there's a relationship there in how much they blamed the perpetrator. There's no relationship in the embezzlement condition. So this measure does seem to predict attributions to discrimination and how much you blame the alleged perpetrator. I'll hand over to Keon now.
Right, so we're still talking about how these definitional boundaries of discrimination affect things in the real world. So we found a measure, and it seems to be predictive of how people respond to things that look like discrimination. So we wanted to extend that. So that's, again, the same three of us. So that's Katy and myself and Colette van Laar. And we wanted to know, does this predict real things in the real world? So things we can put a finger on and say, well, this matters and it's happening now. And so we decided to look at the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate. And it's a very straightforward design. We just included a measure of how much people like All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. So the people who feel more comfortable with All Lives Matter than Black Lives Matter. And we wanted to know what predicted it. And there are some things that, of course, should predict it, like implicit and explicit racial bias. We expected that. a preference for colorblindness, right-wing politics, all that stuff. But we also wanted to know if definitional boundaries of discrimination was a contributing factor to that. So people who narrowed the range of what counted as discrimination would also have a preference for all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. And that's exactly what we found when we ran the regressions. So of course, implicit racism and colorblindness were predictive. But what was interesting is that definitional boundaries were not only predictive, but they were more predictive than other things that seem like they intuitively should be predictive, like explicit racism, collective narcissism, and right-wing politics. It is more predictive than whether you are right or left-wing politically. And that is an interesting finding. So these DBDs do seem to be predictive of stuff that matters. Okay, so last point, I want to return to this inconsistently defined idea. So we talked about a couple ways in which DBDs, definitional boundaries of discrimination, can be inconsistent. We talked about inconsistencies between types, inconsistencies across regions, and inconsistencies between individuals. But what about inconsistencies within individuals? Specifically, what about the kind of person who says, well, if you're doing it against me, then I'm going to have really broad definitional boundaries. Everything counts. But if I'm doing it against you, I'm going to be really narrow. A particular kind of hypocritical double standard. Everyone see what I mean? A kind of person who shifts the boundaries up and down in a way that benefits them or their in-group. Can you test for that? And we thought, well, of course we could. So it's the same three of us again. And we thought we'd test for that by taking the DBD items and simply swapping out the words. So in one version of the words, it's prejudice or it's discrimination against women by men. And in another version, it's discrimination against men by women. And that's all you have to do. Of course, these are between participants designed, so they don't see both. But we wanted to see, do men, specifically white men, that was our population, do they respond differently to these different items, which are actually the same items, but the targets are different. Everybody still with me? So of course they do. So that's what we find. So the first finding, this is in the UK, we find that there is a difference, not a huge difference, but it is a statistically significant difference where the men are saying, no, when it's sexism against women, we're raising that bar a bit. It gets a bit narrower. It's harder to recognize the discrimination. When it's sexism against men, then we're dropping the bar. Now we're going to make it a bit broader. So that was the first study. Second study in the same paper, we did it this time with Americans, again, all white men, this time white people versus Black people. So when it was racism against Black people, they raised it up. And when it was racism against white people, they really dropped it down. They're like, no, 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 pretty much everything counts. But it's much harder to recognize racism against Black people, which is interesting. And then in a third study, we wanted to know why they were doing this. Now, the paper, I have to say, has been accepted. So it was in press when we first did the slides, and it's accepted now. And if you read the paper, there's a much more complicated story that involves a number of different things, including collective narcissism. I'm not going to tell you that story now. I'm just going to get you right to the conclusion of the paper, which is essentially that social dominance orientation appears to be the best explanation of why they're doing this. So low social dominance orientation white men don't really do this. They see discrimination kind of equally, whether you're asking them about white people or Black people. High social dominance orientation men do this. Then you see that big gap. If it's against them, then it's really broad, everything counts. If it's against other people, then it's really narrow, nothing counts. So that's what we get. Okay, and that's how we get to the end. That's the conclusion. So we raised this mystery that everybody says you shouldn't discriminate. Nobody thinks they're a discriminatory person. Everybody agrees discrimination is wrong, yet most people discriminate a lot. They discriminate all the time, and they discriminate even when they're looking you in the eye and you're asking them, would you treat these groups of people differently? And they're like, yes. The question then was, how do they do that? How do they maintain that and square that circle? And the answer is that they define discrimination really, really badly. They describe it in ways that are narrow. So essentially nothing counts. You have to prove intention. You have to prove all sorts of things so that it's impossible to pin any specific thing down as discrimination. And then they define it really inconsistently, that even within individuals, they move the bar up and down so that it's very hard to pin a single action as discrimination. And that is how people can maintain those two ideas in their heads all the time. And that is the end. So hopefully that was interesting and you found something to take home from that. And I think we are now open for questions and almost entirely on time.
Yeah, well done us.
Well done.
Somebody's put Top Gear in the chat.
Yes, I think that was the
yeah.
Jeremy Clarkson explanation.
Yes, that's
yeah.
Jeremy Clarkson. Yeah, somebody's seen Top Gear in Canada.
Great. Do we have questions? I can't always tell whether people are putting their hand up or clapping. The problem with Zoom. And if nobody has questions, I can start. I want to know what you think about jokes, racial jokes, homophobic jokes, because there's something that people can excuse really easily, and they're really common, right? And even if you're listening to people telling these jokes, there's sort of, you get criticized if you call them out, right? Because they're just a joke and you don't have a sense of humor or something. So have you looked at all at whether your measure relates to perceptions of jokes? And it could be white jokes against whites versus blacks, for example. You might assume differences there.
I think that's a great question. We haven't done that yet. But have we? I don't think we have. No, I don't think we have, but I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
Because it's definitely a thing. And it connects up to a lot of the different issues that we've talked about in the talk today. So it speaks to intentions, that I'm just being funny, I'm just sort of lightening the mood, I'm just telling a joke. It also speaks to this idea of oversensitivity that Keon was talking about as well, and that accusation that that you're taking things too seriously, you're being sensitive to things that don't matter. I think that's a really, really great suggestion. There is a research literature on racialized jokes, and there is, I think, Michael Plato in Australia. I think he's done something there, particularly on racialized jokes. But you're absolutely right. It's a really it's a real hotspot, I think, for that sort of negotiation between what is and isn't discrimination. It is the case that, and actually I should make sure this is on our slides, Simon Goodman is a qualitative researcher in the UK, and he said that he's done some research to argue that describing something as racist is now more taboo than doing something racist in the first place. It's actually as problematic, or more problematic to say, do you know what? I'm calling that out. I'm not okay with that. That's as, if not more problematic than doing the horribly racist thing in the first place. But I think it's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, I also think that's really interesting. And I was kind of plotting it in my head. I think the most straightforward first study would just be measuring DVDs and then giving people a bunch of racist jokes and then saying, how racist do you think this joke is? Ostensibly it's a study about how racist a joke is. But what we're really seeing is that correlation between the overall negativity towards the joke and the DVD scores. And I imagine, even though we haven't done this yet, I imagine that it'd be a really straightforward correlation. And this would be a thing. This is exactly the kind of thing we're measuring. Yeah, I think jokes are definitely a barrier because I think, like microaggressions, jokes are set up in a way to allow you to do discriminatory things while existing under the threshold. That is the purpose of telling racist jokes, much like the purpose of everything that they call microaggression, specifically to exist under that threshold of discrimination. And so in some ways, I think the DVD literature, like other stuff, would tap into the many ways in which people navigate that space to continue to be discriminatory while existing under the threshold. But I do think it's well worth exploring. So thank you. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
Other questions? Sean, are you getting ready to ask a joke? Or not ask a joke, ask a question.
Sure. Thank you very much. A really interesting talk. One of the things that I'm curious about is religion and homophobia. And so I guess my question is where comments that I might view or people might view as homophobic are rooted in religious teachings and used as a justification.
Keon, do you want to jump in on this? Because or I can talk about justification and suppression a bit.
Yeah, I guess I could jump in it a bit. Although I'm not sure if I'm necessarily going to respond in the way that deals with in a theoretically sufficient way. But I do think it's interesting because, first of all, we have to acknowledge that religiosity in general correlates with prejudice against almost everybody, including other religious people. So it's definitely a concern that comes out in the data that religiosity tends to be predictive of all sorts of negativity. But I think what you're talking about specifically is religiosity used as a justification mechanism for saying this is why this kind of prejudice is not a bad thing. But what I think is interesting is that that can also cut multiple ways, that religiosity can be used as a justification for all sorts of things, for why you shouldn't like Muslims, even for why you shouldn't like Black people. There's just some religions that say you shouldn't like Black people. And so I think that's an interesting case that's very frequently used. But I also think that it's not a thing that religious people necessarily have to do. So some of the religious research kind of looks at the disjunction between people who are very outward facing with their religion and inward facing with their religion. And inward facing religious people can say, I really love Jesus, but I don't feel the need to march in the street to harass gay people. So there are definitely logical ways of breaking that down. And I kind of think the religiousness as justification is exactly that, a justification mechanism, much like the other stuff that we're seeing, rather than a genuine motivation thing. I'm not sure if that gets at what you're asking about, but maybe Katy would address it a bit better.
So this makes me think there's a couple of studies by Chris Crandall on democratic values. So they're literally hot off the press. They're like 2021 kind of papers. So, working in that justification suppression tradition, when do people deploy these kind of arguments and when do they not deploy these kind of arguments? And his evidence, experimental evidence, suggests that people totally do deploy some of these arguments, but they only deploy them in cases that fit those, fit their existing positions. So people who are kind of racist will use those kinds of arguments, but only in racialized conditions. They don't apply. So people who are freedom of speechers only use the freedom of speech argument if they're kind of racist and they're in a racialized context. They don't use those arguments in a pro-abortion context, for example. So there's religion itself, the culture, the membership, and the practice that I think Keon's talked about, but there's also the sort of strategic use of it. And you see that strategic use of it in that seems to be very sort of, I think what's really coming out of the literature, there's a lot of people working in this area at the moment, and what's really coming out in the literature, I think, is the extent to which this is really intergroup behavior. And there's all sorts of other things that people are pulling in, but the way that they're pulling them in are strategic too. They're speaking to their intergroup motivations in order to expand and narrow this definition in particular kinds of contexts, but not in others. But it's a good question, thank you.
Yoko.
Hi, thank you very much for your work. It's very, very interesting. And I usually approach discrimination from the people who are kind of like feeling discriminated side. So it is very interesting to hear the story or the analysis, or looking into the act, like people who act on the discrimination. And so just thinking about action, the people who act discrimination perspective, I was wondering, so maybe this is related to the issue of inconsistency within the individuals who take the act of discrimination. So I was kind of wondering if somebody like the kind of like loop effect. So intention, maybe it is an important part of it, but at the same time, there's a kind of inconsistency related with kind of changes of the idea about the act itself through the communication, through this process of action and reaction from the people, like the victimized, or the people who said that the subject of their act. So maybe I don't know if I'm making my points clear. But maybe there, I was wondering if there's any situation where people didn't really mean that, I'm actually taking an act of discrimination, but then they realize that that could be an act of discrimination based on the response from the person who are there talking to.
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying, you're describing a kind of dynamic process of defining it, where you do something and you kind of see how everyone else responds. And if people say, oh, that's really funny, mate, then you think it's great. And if people say, wow, you're really racist, then you tone it back a bit, that kind of thing. I think there was, I mean, it's not a study we can claim any credit for that we did, but there was a really great one where I think someone did exactly that. Oh, wait, no, maybe Katy did exactly that study. Okay, maybe Katy also did it. But the one I remember was just a study where they did exactly that, where they asked people to say something and then the experimenter either just nodded or said, wow, you're really racist. And then they checked back with them a month later and saw how they responded to different things, and the people who got the negative feedback were less likely to do it again. I'll have to look the study up, but people do this, apparently. People do this.
Yeah, it's certainly a thing. I mean, that's an experimental design that you're describing, and yeah, that's ringing bells with me as well. That sort of, that reinforcement. The example that I'm thinking of actually is some qualitative work. And because the sort of history of this project is that I had some doctoral students, and my doctoral students were doing research with people with minorities, so gay men in university and African Caribbean men in elite universities. And they designed their interviews and to talk about homophobia and to talk about racism. And they went out into the field and they came back really frustrated because they wanted to talk about racism, and their participants were saying, nope, never happens to me, everything's fine, never happens, like Ollie in our extract. And then and I'm saying, well, yeah, but maybe, if you just, if you don't say, have you ever experienced racism? Maybe if you say, what sort of things happen with your friends? How do you get on with your friends? What are the sort of funny things? What did they say when you first met them? What was the first impression that they had with you? And what we gradually began to see was the difficulty and the trauma actually involved in making sense of an experience and realizing, actually, do you know what? That was kind of racist. That was kind of homophobic. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to be the victim. Nobody wants to be the person who is experiencing these things. And one of the citations, which is on the slide there, there's one about friendship. And so we wrote a paper about what happens between friends and how difficult it is within friendship when people say those things to you, when people make the jokes, that Vicky was talking about, when they tease you, when they do the banter, and they call you, the boys, they had their friend who they called Little Gay Bob, right? So when you have your friend who you call Little Gay Bob, and they say, well, he didn't mind, he loved it, he loved being called Little Gay Bob, he thought it was a great nickname. And so the reinforcement that you can get often makes you think that things are okay, but that's because it's actually so hard to challenge the things that happen in friendship. It's so hard when it's your friends, or when it's your in-laws, or when it's your mum, or when it's your housemates, your first year undergraduate, and they're your housemates, and they're the only people that and they talk to you in this way. So I think that in terms of the kind of that, the act of calling out is really, really hard to do in that environment. And a lot of the time our participants said, well, maybe they're being kind of racist, but I don't know. So what they often said was, well, maybe that's what's happening. I can't really tell. It's difficult for me to know. Can we change the subject, please? Because it's a really difficult, it's a really, really tight spot to be in when your friends do that stuff to you. I don't know if that answers your question.
Other questions?
There's one in the chat
Ah.
From Holly. Hi, Holly.
So that's a question about discrimination in the workplace. And there was articles in the paper just this week about this, whether people are worried about going back to work because they've been relieved of the interpersonal discrimination. When they work remotely, there's less of that. Or is it, I guess the question is working from home creating a safer workplace, or does it just hide discrimination?
Yeah, I don't think I could answer that from a position of like expertise or, that we've published papers on it, but I would say that working from home, I think, as in my experience as a minoritized person, yeah, it is great. I mean, it does cut back on the number of microaggressions you get every day quite aggressively because there's just no one to do them. I do also think that working from home creates other types of discrimination that I have noticed, particularly as someone with small children, that my life is drastically different from the lives of people without small children. And you get different houses, different setups, different levels of noise, different qualities of internet connection, and these things are noticeable. And so the discrimination that you get is no longer as immediately on one's physicality, but it can be on the quality of your laptop or your internet. And these things continue to give off markers of wealth and status. So that'd be the only answer I'd give.
Holly, did you want to jump in at all?
No, it is pretty much, I also think that it's, there's going to be a lot to learn over the next several years as we start to look back on virtual workplaces. I think there's also, I personally love working from home, so I'm always looking for excuses to extend it, but I also think that there are a lot of downsides to it, and I think it can increase isolation in teams as well. I think that people that maybe are more inclined to work with people that they get along with, or they they feel connected to, or it's easier for them to really only just link up with those people when they can really control who they have to come into contact with. So I think that on the other end, well, my first impulse was to think that it creates this much safer workplace. It's great for a lot of people who also have difficulties around or insecurities around being in public. But I think it also kind of enables cliquism or leaving people out to a certain extent in some types of workplace cultures. So I think, again, that it's way too early to be talking conclusively on it, but I think it's a really interesting line of thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other thoughts? Michaela.
Yeah, hi Vicky. Hi everybody. I'm sorry, especially for myself, because I lost the first piece of the presentation. It's interesting. I will go back and look at the recording. But one thing that we notice here in Canada, I'm Italian, but working in Canada. One of the things that we are noticing here in Canada is also the discrimination between or among newcomers. So it's not only white people, whatever is the definition of white people, and racialized groups, but it also between racialized groups. And sometimes there is much more racism, hate, and discrimination there than between a white Canadian for generation towards another. Do you have any comment on that? Because that would be interesting for us. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't have a comment except to acknowledge that what you're saying is absolutely true. So that's true everywhere as well. So in the UK, some of the worst racism is also Black versus Asian, Asian versus Black racism, with nothing to do with white people. So the idea that ethnic minorities all just love each other is a bit of a silly fallacy. I mean, ethnic minorities have no more in common than they do with white people. They're just not white people. That's literally the only thing. So that's definitely true. But I do think it's an interesting idea, and one that we've toyed with concerning how to measure it in the experiments that we're doing. Because for us, the interesting question there is how do people then perceive it? So if a white person tells a racist joke, is it the same racist or different racist than if an Asian person tells the racist joke? And how people draw those boundaries and what redefines it as not racist is the interesting question that I think we'd be delving into.
Mm. So the difficulty is that as we know in experimental designs, when people take part in experiments, they're very alert to how they may look to the experimenter and how they may look to themselves. So we have run a couple of designs looking at, so we call them sort of punching up, punching down designs. So a punching down design is a majority discriminating against a minority. And you can have punching up designs where you have minorities discriminating against majorities. Keon's talked about this a little bit. And you can have also these designs where they're minorities discriminating against other minorities. And it is interesting in as much as, the sort of prototypes of what we think of as racism are overwhelmingly the actions of white people. So we know that from the research literature. The prototypical form of racism, for example, is white on black. And is particularly people in positions of power. So a police officer, a white police officer, and a black member of the public, for example. What we also know, and this is something that Keon and I we've been struggling with in our designs, we also know that, and this is some work by Nyla Branscombe in Kansas, that when minorities discriminate, so migrants, people of color, gay men, women, when however it is that you cut that cake, but minorities who discriminate are judged more harshly than white people who discriminate. So it's a sort of double-edged sword that according to Nyla Branscombe, that there's an expectation that people who have experienced discrimination should somehow know better, that they should be drawing on their experience and not kind of replicating these things. So it's a sort of double form of discrimination that we do tend to judge minorities more harshly. And yeah, we've been playing with this. We haven't been able to replicate it, in fact. But it's definitely a thing. You're absolutely right that there's something going on there. And I think the difficulty that we're having is pulling apart the socially desirable responding, that nobody wants to say something nasty. Certainly in the UK and in Leuven, where we've been running this data, nobody wants to say something nasty about the minority. And that seems to be cross-cutting the other things that we think are going on. As Keon said, the study that Keon showed you, we very deliberately did it with white men. Because things start to get much more complicated and in other kinds of. Keon, just sort of, you looked at me then, Keon, as I said.
No, it's true. That we did that on purpose. And the thing that's not in the paper is that we've tried to run the study. So you can't put every single study you run in the paper, every version of things in the paper. But what's interesting is that Katy's right. That things get tricky once you start doing other people. So once you start doing women, it's just the results aren't as sharp as they are when you just use white men. And we didn't test for things like whether they were, straight or gay or anything like that. But we suspect that if you include sexual minorities, the results might change again. And exactly why they change, whether this is because of a genuine difference or whether it's because of a recognizable language of, no, we know what discrimination is. We can recognize this. This is a pattern amongst all groups that are minoritized. That's an interesting question. But if you want the best, strongest, clearest evidence of this stuff, you just do it on white men, and then it comes out really clear every time.
Sorry to the white men.
Yeah.
Sean.
Oh, we do. Okay, I didn't know if we were going to have time for another question. Okay, wonderful. So more of a comment, and it goes along with Miguel's point. So I do research on queer people in the labor market, and we've done a number of interviews, and with queer people. And one of the things that comes out when we ask people about their disclosures in the workplace, disclosing that they're a sexual minority, one of the things that we've asked is, but what are the cues that you look for to know that this person would be receptive and be accepting? And one of the things that queer people often say is if it's an immigrant, they're concerned about religious background and country of origin. And so in particular, people from the Middle East and those who are Muslim, for example, are warning signs for queer people that maybe this disclosure would not be a good idea, that this might be unsafe. And so I'm just curious, maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, maybe if you have any ideas, but then also this situation where queer people are potentially discriminating against, or, you know, to avoid discrimination, they're avoiding particular groups of people and perhaps could be engaging in microaggressions or discrimination against those groups. So it's a complicated puzzle, but it definitely comes out in the interviews. And this is one of the overarching things that our respondents say is if it's an immigrant from a Middle Eastern country, they're quite concerned about disclosing their sexual orientation, especially if it's a man.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think about that personally because I'm Jamaican, and if a gay person said, I'm not going to tell that guy because Jamaicans hate gay people, I'd be like, yeah, that's true. Like it's a country full of people who just don't like gay people. I personally love gay people, right? But most other people I know from Jamaica do not. So if someone were to make that assumption, I wouldn't really hold it against them, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just buying into my own oppression. I have no idea. But it does seem like it's a reasonable stance to a certain extent, and it's also things that all minoritized people do. So I wouldn't necessarily walk up to a white person with an American, one of the Confederate flags as a T-shirt, and the South will rise again and think, I'm not going to talk to him. I'll talk to the next person. So I think it's a strategy everybody takes, but I can see that then it can become a secondarily minoritizing strategy. And exactly what you do about that, I must say, I don't know. I'd say in my personal life, I don't hold it against any gay people, but maybe that's not the right answer.
I think we are in, and are we okay for time, Vicky? Can I get? I think
Yes,
I think we're seeing a lot of contexts in which these kinds of conflicts are happening at the moment. So we're much better at intersectionality. We're much better at understanding the sort of multiple and competing identities that people can have. And it is a study that I really want to do, but I'm kind of scared to do, about how people with different incompatible identities, how they talk about and make sense of the discrimination perpetrated by their own group and by the other group. So, for example, we have, I'm sure this is happening in Canada as well, the sort of the trans and the what do we call them? The feminists,
the trans exclusionary feminists,
that's
the
it.
TERFs,
The trans exclusionary feminists, right? So you've got two groups of people who are both simultaneously claiming that they're being victimized and also claiming that it's the other group that is doing the victimization. We've also had in the UK, we had our left-wing Labour Party. There was accusations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and you had different groups of the Labour Party, some of them saying, yes, anti-Semitism is a thing, and other groups of them saying, no, anti-Semitism isn't a thing. This story has been cooked up in order to attack the leadership. So there are a number of contexts in which it is theoretically possible to compare the sort of competing definitions of discrimination that are existing within these groups that are in conflict. But I feel a bit queasy about doing it, really, because I don't really want to generate some research that says, this group of people, really are as evil as we think.
Yeah, it's okay to avoid the Muslims in your workplace because they probably hate queers. That's not the kind of research you want to publish. It looks bad and sounds bad. Sounds really racist, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't want that on my CV.
Yeah.
But I think what we are seeing are accusations and counter accusations of discrimination, which are very heated, very polarized, and maybe the polarization is the place to sort of think about it. The extent of it. So we know that I am making this up a little bit. Wasn't there a thing with Trump trying to get to round up the sort of pink support? Wasn't there a thing. I am making this up a little bit. That with gay men supporting Trump, because that it was a sort of anti-immigrant concern. Am I making that up? I might be.
I have never heard of that.
Right,
but
I'm making it up then. Don't
sounds
quote me.
possible,
Edit that bit
but
out of the
I don't
video.
know. Yeah.
But yeah, so competing claims of discrimination, and actually probably in most of these cases they're both right. That there's homophobia is happening and racism is happening at the same time. Both of those things are true. In fact, don't quote me.
Can I ask you a question about tolerance of racism and whether your measure, you expect that it would correlate with that at all?
Yeah. Is that Folberg?
No,
Is
it's
that-
Hunt.
Yeah, I think
Carrie
I've seen
Ryan
that
is-
paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it started coming out almost exactly at the same time, and I can
Yeah.
see a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity. And I think if you go further back, you could also say that there's more generic effects wherein people judge stuff more harshly than if one person does it versus another. So you just, it's the same effect. And I think the difference for me when I read the tolerance of racism papers is that these are people who are doing a kind of attitudinal thing to something that's been collaboratively defined as racist. They're like, this is kind of racist, but I'm okay with that. This is fine. Versus when you're looking at something, trying to decide how we categorize it in the first place. And I think for me, it's something slightly more cognitively interesting, and maybe that's just because it's my own paper, to say, no, we are recategorizing what you're doing as something else, according to these numbers, rather than saying, no, that's what you're doing, but we're fine with it.
Yeah.
That's a major difference I see.
Yeah, so that it's not tolerance. It's not tolerance to racism. It's just not racist.
It's just not. Yeah.
By this argument, it's something else. I mean, I think the other thing which is going on, and Keon and I are kind of different on this, is the extent to which this is. So for me, this is something which is cultural. So this is about the cultural resources that people use, and because they're cultural resources, so cultural rather than in the head. So this isn't about people's attitudes or their beliefs or their motivations, although all of those things matter. These are about arguments which are circulated in media, in letters to newspapers, in political speeches. So they exist sort of out there as ideas, and a lot of these arguments that exist there as ideas, they're testable, right? These are testable hypotheses. So a lot of these ideas that we're calling definitional boundaries arguments, that intentions matter, that people are too sensitive, that this is a problem that's basically going away. These are all falsifiable arguments. So one of the things that's kind of slightly downstream or upstream that we want to do is to start thinking about, well, how do you challenge those arguments in public discourse? If we know that people often make an intention argument, well, you can push back against that. You can say, here is all the evidence that we have that shows that it's not really about your intentions, that your intentions are often, not always, but often not a good explanation for why you do what you do. And that's what I think is the real strength of this approach, is that if we think of these as kind of cultural resources that exist in our environment, well, that means we can challenge them, and that means we can change them to encourage a different kind of thinking, different kinds of tools for thinking about what discrimination is, and ultimately I think that's what I want to be doing with this research.
So are these external justifications or internal justifications? Do
Well,
you think people believe these things about themselves, or do you think it's just their discourse?
I think that people deploy these arguments strategically when it serves their best interests to do so. So for me, and that's the thing about people applying these inconsistently, right? So this isn't an individual difference, that there isn't that this isn't a continuum of people who believe these things or they don't believe these things. They use these things strategically as the context changes. And you can think of them as, arguments that are, that are in memory. You can think of them as being things which are inside people's heads in an individual sense. But you can also think of them as, you can think of those representations as things that have been learned culturally. And because they've been learned, well, they're up for grabs, right? We can undo those and we can change those. Vicky, you look like you're thinking, no, that's nonsense.
No, I mean, I kind of agree with you, but I know that when you confront people too directly about things, you know, if it's outside of their acceptance range and it's too threatening, they're just going to go the other direction. So you could get boomerang effects, right?
Yeah.
Where they're just going to put their foot down and, reinforce that this is, this is just you and your weirdness about discrimination and not, how most people see discrimination. So some sort of consensual messaging that other people think this is discrimination is kind of important.
Yeah. Thank you.
But you didn't answer whether it's an internal argument or an external argument. Like, is this just something that you're trying to convince other people about, or are you convinced yourself? Are you really believing these things about yourself? That I'm not
I kind of think in my own head, whether it's internal or external, for me, that's a lot blurrier in general than a lot of people think. So that there's a reason why most Jamaicans really treat gay people horribly, but then as they move from one country to another, Jamaican immigrants are not actually very similar to people who live in Jamaica. They're much more similar to whatever population they happen to live in than people who live in Jamaica. And that there's quite a lot of research showing that social norms affect our behavior more than what we'd call our internal beliefs about how we should treat other people, that they're actually slightly more predictive of how we respond to other people. So in that sense, whether something's internal or external is an interesting question, but I think sometimes a lot of really externally sounding stuff ends up having very internally looking effects and vice versa.
Good point.
Yeah, I'd go with that.
Other comments, other questions? John.
So based on all of the research you've presented here today, if you were to speak with people who are in charge of an organization and are concerned about discrimination and such within their organization, are there any applications or lessons that you would like to encourage those organizations or groups to take from the work that you've done and what you've presented here today?
If I could go first, the first thing I would say is drop all subjectivity in your definitions of discrimination. It should be a totally irrelevant thing whether any particular individual feels that this counts as offensive or this crosses the line, as we've shown that people are terrible at making those judgments and that they make them in ways that are inconsistent and really quite unhelpful. I ask them as much as possible, focus on the numbers. If you have an organization where the median pay for women is 40% below the median pay for men, you have an organization with a problem. If you have an organization in which white people are promoted every 7 years and black people are promoted every 14 years, you have an organization with a problem. And whether any individual sees any of this as being offensive is not something you should pay attention to, because as far as all the research indicates, this moves around so much and it moves around in ways that protect the people who are doing the discriminating. So stop thinking about it in those terms. That would be what I would say.
That was a very definite answer, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good one, and it's also in contrast to what I've seen from a lot of organizations who characterize discrimination as from the perspective of the victim, the person who is feeling harassed. Do they feel harassed? Therefore it is.
Yeah, and I think people do that as an act of charity, and they're doing it to try to be nice. But as Katy also pointed out, that it's deeply unhelpful when you're dealing with close family context or close friends context, in which people will say, for a variety of reasons, this doesn't count because I like that person or because it was just banter. But this is totally uninteresting. That gets some numbers, and when the numbers show differences, that's fine, whether people like it or not.
And having we also know that having a diverse management isn't sufficient. to bring through these changes either. So this is the queen bee stuff, the self-group distancing stuff. So at the end of the day, I mean I'm with Keon on this. At the end of the day, as much as possible in organizational terms, you take the humans out of the equation, right? Take the discretion out of the equation. Take out it. You got to write it into policy. So as much as possible, you set your processes based on standard policy. You look at the outcomes, and because yes, a lot of the things that we think are helpful in understanding what's happening really aren't. So yeah, I've never been asked that question before, though. It's a really great question. Thank you.
Anything else? We have just 2 more minutes left. So
Can I make a quick comment on that? I second everything we're saying. There is just a situation here in Canada that we see a lot. So cities like Toronto, they are everything, multilinguistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic. And organizations there are diverse on any kind of piece of the wheel that you look at. And then we have rural areas where a lot of people live, in which diversity, if you consider diversity as visible diversity or linguistic diversity, is not a thing. There is not diversity. So in those situations, organizations might want to open up, but they don't know how to do so. And so maybe what we just discussed might be reframed or need to be reframed a little bit. I don't know how, but that might be an interesting thing to observe.
One of the things that we wrote about, this is not with Keon, this is with some kind of other colleagues a long time ago. These were kids in schools, and we asked them about racism and how much they thought that racism was a thing. And the kids who were in the cities, they said, yeah, racism doesn't happen in our cities. We're really diverse. It's in the countryside that the racism happens. It doesn't happen in the cities. It happens in the countryside. The kids in the countryside, they said exactly. They said, yeah, it does. There's no racism in the country because there's no minorities here. It only happens in the cities. So it's always the case that racism, discrimination, homophobia, sexism, transphobia. It's always somebody else, somewhere else, either geographically or socially or historically. It's always some other group of people. It's never right here with us that we're doing this. And I think that's where Keon's point about the numbers really comes, really gets us back to that you can have, I have a colleague who's written about kind of racism in charities. And when you have, and actually this is like racism in universities as well, where you have a group of people who really believe that they're good people. In some ways, they're the worst because when we're convinced that we're on the sides of the angels, then we're least able and willing to look really hard about what we're doing, because we're sure that we're good. Then that that thing that I did and that thing that I said and that person who was really upset and that person who lost their job, well, that can't have been because of racism, because look, we're the good guys, we're the nice people. Yeah, that wasn't really an answer to a question either. It's always a problem when we think that this is something which is happening elsewhere, and it's very, very typical that we think it's happening elsewhere.
wonderful, thank you. And it's happening here, and we know it happens here. And
it's been really disappointing because I always thought that Canada was a lovely country, and then I met,
it's like America but better.
Yes, much better. And then I've got some Canadian friends, and over the last 10 years, they've been telling me the kind of stuff that's been happening. I'm so disappointed in you guys, because really, we really thought that you were, that you were holding the progressive flag for us. We're very, very disappointed in you, I'm afraid.
They
I am
still
teasing
have,
you.
Healthcare and fewer shootings, so I think it's still better. It's still better.
It can be better, but not good, right?
Yeah,
So,
there's always more, isn't
yeah,
there?
there's always more.
Mm.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank you both, Keon and Katy, very much for an amazing presentation, great answers to questions. So many questions because we're really interested in this topic. And you will have seen, or you probably don't even know this, people from the university, from the community here to hear you speak. And a lot of people have asked about your PowerPoint and the presentation. So we'll make sure that's available as well. And we'll have you back in a few years to
Thank you.
talk
Thank you.
about the next steps.
And
Great.
drop us a line, right?
Thank
So,
you.
so you know, keep in touch, get in touch. We're very happy to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.
Cheers.
Cheers.